Hello? Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you. So this afternoon, we're going to be talking about monitoring. And one of the things I'd like you all to keep in mind is that monitoring alone doesn't do anything. It's what we do with the data that we collect from monitoring. It's how we report those data, and it's how we use them. And so that's a really, really essential piece. If we're merely going to collect information, that doesn't help anybody do anything. It's about how we use the data. So do keep that in mind as we go through. So welcome to the session. What I'm going to do first is introduce our three speakers. So I'm going to do the full introductions now, and then when each of them make their presentation, I won't repeat that information, of course. And so when I mention your name, speakers, if you could just stand up so everybody knows who you are for a second, you don't have to stay standing, then that would be a good thing. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Juanbo Park, who is a professor in the Department of Education and the director of the Centre for Global Citizenship Education at Chungnam National University. His research interests relate to educational policy evaluation, and he's currently conducting research to monitor the implementation of GCED and its impact. He has recently been a visiting fellow at George Mason Uni in Virginia, near where I first met him, and he's engaged in educational development projects and research for developing countries, and also provides his expertise internationally. Before his current position, he worked for the Korean Educational Development Institute, KEDI, that is one of the government-funded research institutes in the country. So that's Professor Park. Next is Rachel Parker, and Rachel Parker is from the Australian Council for Educational Research, often called ACER, and she's most recently been involved in research around intercultural competence, around global citizenship pedagogies and assessment, and has led the design of a global citizenship assessment framework with ASEAN countries. With APCU, Rachel's led a team to investigate ways of monitoring global citizenship education in the Asia Pacific, and she's been working on that project with stakeholders in Australia, from where she comes, in the Philippines, and here in Korea. And then our third presenter will be Professor Aaron Benavot, and he's Professor of Global Education Policy at the University of Albany, State University of New York. He's explained educational issues from comparative perspectives, looking both globally and looking critically at matters of global citizenship and, most recently, climate education. His experience includes directing of the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is a fantastic resource for all of us, and is currently the lead for indicator development for the MECE project, which is developing indicators on climate education. Aaron also co-founded NISEM, which is a community of academics and scholars, which is looking to ensure that there is focus on including humanistic, social-emotional learning content in texts and resources. So although we've got a common core of interests across the three people, they're coming from very, very different perspectives and have been involved in very, very different work. And so I think that that gives us an excellent opportunity to think about some different perspectives on monitoring, particularly monitoring of this rather difficult area that we are confronting right now. So thank you, and I'd like to introduce Professor Park. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kale, for the detailed introduction of myself. Thank you. My name is Hwan-Bo Park, and I'm a professor of Chungnam National University. It is a great honor for me to be invited here to share my tentative research result. Since 2018, I have conducted research related to the GCED with the UNESCO APSEU, and today I'd like to share the tentative result of the research on GCED monitoring framework in Korea conducted in this year. My presentation consists of 5 sections, and I will introduce the research framework, the background of this research and research framework, and I will share briefly the tentative result of this year's research. As all of you, unlike the other SDG targets, such as ensuring educational opportunity or improving educational conditions, which were focus of the existing global education agenda, such as EFA or MDGs, the SDG 4.7 cover a wide range of value and content of education. For example, global citizenship, gender equality, sustainable development. So there are many difficulties in developing and monitoring common indicators, both at global and national level. So the international community proposed 5 indicators to monitor SDG 4.7, but among these, only 4.7.1 indicator, which measure the mainstreaming in policy and curriculum and teacher education, is monitored as a global indicators. As you know, SDG 4.7.1 global indicator is monitoring based on the 1974 recommendation by UNESCO. While the global indicators provide guidance for monitoring, they still have limitation for a depth investigation of the progress and situation in each country. Against this backdrop, the UNESCO APSEU has conducted relevant research with me and developed a monitoring system in Korea since 2018. Through the desk review and Delphi survey, we conceptualized GCED into 6 thematic areas and proposed relevant keywords that can capture them. Actually, media literacy is newly considered as one of learners' global citizenship competency in this year. Using this framework, we have analyzed the mainstreaming of GCED in regional education policy. Especially, we counted the number of keywords in the policy document produced by each regional office of education. In Korea, the superintendent is elected by resident, and 17 regional offices of education in Korea have autonomy in the planning, budgeting, and implementation of educational policy for primary and secondary education. So monitoring the mainstream of GCED in each region of Korea would not only be useful for understanding the Korean case, but also able to provide the implication of global monitoring. In this year, we also analyzed the factor for predicting schools' participation in GCED policy. According to the result, most regional education offices have staff in charge of GCED, although there are differences in number and proportion. The second point is the GCED-related policy and projects are approximately 10% of all education projects. In 2022, the decrease from the 2020 and 2021 would be understood by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The overall GCED policy are being implemented in Korea to a certain degree stably. This graph shows there are regional differences in proportion of GCED policy project and change trend from 2019 to this year. You can see Incheon is the most active region related to GCED in Korea. As all of you know, Incheon Declaration, the Incheon is held in the World Conference on Education. Among the thematic area of GCED, the sustainable development and global citizenship is the largest portion of the GCED policy. Next question focused on the factor that predict schools' participation in GCED policy. Even as GCED become mainstreaming in educational policy, it does not ensure the actual change at the school level. So we try to figure out why some school participate in GCED policy project and some school does not. Using school information data collected by each school, it is a kind of administrative educational statistic. We analyze the school factor affect the participation of GCED policy in Seoul Metropolitan. We conduct a random forest analysis, one of the machine learning methods. According to the result of analyzing the characteristic of schools participating in GCED policy, infrastructure and support for students were found to be a very important factor in participating in GCED policy. The red scale means classroom. Mainstreaming GCED in education policy does not mean the expansion of universal concept of GCED and suggests that the degree and speed of policy mainstreaming may vary depending on how global citizenship education is interpreted and reorganized by regional context. Second point is related to the implementation issues. There is a need to not only develop and provide GCED policy and program, but also improve educational conditions for participating in them. So I'd like to recommend the four recommendations. First one is, in order to more effectively monitor the GCED policy and utilize the result, it is necessary to establish an institutional foundation, including regulation and staff and organization for monitoring GCED at national level. Second point is that it is necessary to share the result of monitor GCED and use them for policy feedback. Third point is that it is necessary to link GCED monitoring indicator with the national educational statistic, including education management system, information system, EMIS. It is very important to monitor the GCED in policy level, but it is also important to feedback to develop the more effective GCED policy. So this one is maybe I'd like to talk about this the second round. Thank you very much.
Since you have just a little more time,
Okay.
would you be able to go back to your slide where you had the data on the different predictors, on the different factors?
Okay.
That would be interesting, I think, for people to have a little bit longer look at that particular slide.
Could you back to my slide? Could you? Okay, thank you. Oops. Yeah, here. Then I emphasize on the infrastructure, education infrastructure. That we analyze the educational statistics, and we found the number of classroom for available grouping is very important factor to participate in GCED policy. And second one is the number of ICT room. And third one is support for education activity. It is related to budget and the financial resources. So, and also other point is that direct support for student. You know, in Korea, the Korean government to try to develop the GCED policy and try to implement the GCED policy in both at the regional level and school level. But sometimes only a few teacher or school are interested in the GCED policy project, because the GCED is reflected in national curriculum. So every student and every school and every teacher have to implement GCED in their own class or their school. But GCED policy project is a different thing. The government, regional government develop the GCED policy, such as the school student club, or the field visit, or the classroom, the international, the exchange program with the foreign student. This kind of GCED policy is, in order to participate in this kind of GCED policy, it is very important factor to support the effective infrastructure to participate in this GCED policy. This is the tentative result of our. And another point is the size of school. The size of school is shown to highly relevant to individual school participation in GCED education policy project. Larger schools are more likely to participate in GCED policy. As I said, it is related to the infrastructure. The large schools have a lot of the good condition and a lot of the infrastructure to participate in or implement GCED in school level. So it is necessary to consider how to improve the small school to take part in the GCED policy. Okay, thank you very much, and I will talk later. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you. We'll move straight on to the presentation from Rachel Parker. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Esther. So my name is Rachel Parker. I am a Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Council for Educational Research in Melbourne. I'm joined today by my colleague, Payal Gounder, who is here with me. And we are talking today about monitoring and evaluating global citizenship in the Asia-Pacific region. These are the results of the first phase of a collaborative study between ACER and APSAIL. So today I'll be talking about the study overview, some key findings, recommendations, and how we're proceeding with phase 2. But before I do, and at the risk of showing a really terrible haircut from the 80s, I'd like to present a personal anecdote. What you can see here is me, age 13, a young, enthusiastic Rachel Parker, leading a school protest, a protest in my street with other young children to protest to build a playground at the end of my street. So I was a young, excited person, my first taste of civic participation. And the point is to share that global citizenship is not new. We humans have always acted in support of each other. And perhaps global citizenship education requires us to tap into that collective knowledge rather than invent a new paradigm. So I'll take a sharp pivot now to our research questions for the study we've been working on. Firstly, we're asking what are the enabling conditions at the teacher and school level that support effective global citizenship teaching and learning? And how can these conditions inform tool development and help us better understand teacher and school readiness to implement global citizenship? And finally, how can these instruments be used and what else is needed to establish sustainable global citizenship monitoring systems in the Asia-Pacific region? So briefly on the overview of our study, we conducted a literature review. We also reviewed curricula, policy documents and assessment. And we conducted focus group workshops and questionnaires. Participants included teachers, principals and education experts. Now I'm going to pivot to our findings. So the first finding was regarding describing global citizenship. Now we asked our participants, how would you describe global citizenship? What does it mean to you? And what all of the responses had in common was the diversity of them. So essentially they were all different. And what we discovered was a pattern emerging when we looked at these descriptions. And it appeared to align with a theory of learning complexity developed by Biggs and Collis, Australian researchers, that sees an idea a concept spanning from not having an idea about it, proceeding to having a single idea, several ideas, those ideas are connected, and a transference, those ideas are connected to a new area. So it appeared that the descriptions aligned with different categories. So for example, someone said, and this was categorised as multiple relevant disconnected ideas, being a citizen who is aware, cares and acknowledges a responsibility to accept our world as a total community. So there are several ideas, but they're not connected to each other and they're not transferred to a new area. And we see this as promising because it starts to indicate that there's a way to view describing or understanding global citizenship in terms of a progression. The second finding is regarding enacting global citizenship. So we asked our focus group participants and our questionnaire respondents, how would you describe a typical global citizenship classroom lesson? And what you can see here is the majority of respondents described global citizenship lessons in terms of the how. So global citizenship lessons were conducted through teaching certain subjects, humanities for example, or through environmental science education, and through the medium of relating to real world experiences. What was less apparent was the outcomes for global citizenship education, so describing it in terms of the types of skills that you foster through participating in global citizenship education. We asked our participants about assessing global citizenship. And some of the issues that appeared in discussions, focus group discussions, was a reticence by educators that assessment can be reductive and that systems prioritise scores and rankings that are antithetical to GCED. So essentially they were talking about traditional forms of assessment such as multiple choice questions not really being appropriate or aligning with the transformative nature of global citizenship education. Some considerations that emerged were that good practice in global citizenship education mirrors good practice in assessment in general. So multiple forms of assessment, summative, formative, ongoing assessment is really important, as are appropriate forms of assessment. So if you look at our full report, and I'll share the QR code at the end of this presentation, our participants talk about journals, they talk about portfolios, performances, these types of assessments being aligned with the types of transformative learning, which is global citizenship education. So the key recommendation contained in our report, which we are taking forward in phase 2 of this study, is that we examine the role that teachers, schools and systems play in enacting and monitoring global citizenship. So we want to investigate what different actors know, value and practice. So we have measurement domains on the left side, and on the top we have the key actors, which are teachers, school leaders and staff, and bureaucracy staff, so people who work in government essentially. And we know that global citizenship education is a practice that's situated within a context and a system. So it's important to get a sense of how ready systems are to enact global citizenship. We have a series of other recommendations which we'll take forward in phase 2, which is that we can describe global citizenship on a continuum from superficial learning to deep understanding to help systems identify where they sit and the next steps to improve quality. I think this is a really important discussion to be had about how these skills and competencies, values and attitudes appear in the initial stages and progress over time, and to articulate this. The second recommendation is the alignment between global citizenship and innovative pedagogies. We must implement pedagogies that promote curiosity, critical thinking, open-mindedness, as these align with high quality and effective global citizenship, which is a contentious idea that you have effective global citizenship, but our literature review was informed by a framework of understanding that we were looking at quasi-experimental and experimental studies that measured the impact of global citizenship programs. And the final recommendation is that we frame global citizenship with relevance to political, economic, historical and cultural context of systems, so it's appropriate and applicable to schools, teachers and students. So we focus less on the what, because we can't agree on that, and we focus on the how. And my final slide, our study is continuing this year and next. Our next steps include expanding to incorporate a new country, which is Lao PDR, expanding our framework with findings from the new country, refining and administering a 5-country survey that's based on the enabling factors that support effective global citizenship education, and development of a global citizenship system, school and classroom evaluation toolkit based on the draft framework I just shared. And that's all from me. Thank you for listening.
However, since you just have a few more minutes available before we move on to the next part, I wonder if you could just explain a couple of terms, because I think we often assume that everybody has the same background, and that's not necessarily the case. So you made 2 points. One, you had up there, scores and rankings are antithetic to GCED. And I know that that might be self-explanatory for people who are inside that, but maybe it's a useful thing to talk about that reality, if we think it is one. And the other one is you mentioned progressions. And so again, I know that's very much part of the way we talk in Australia, for example, but it might not be similarly so everywhere else. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about those two concepts, because I think they're germane to where we'll go later on.
Thanks, Esther. And I might even lean on you, because these are your expert areas. So essentially what I meant by scores and rankings, it came out in discussions with focus group participants when they talked about the demands and constraints they were under, so that global citizenship related topics might not necessarily be prioritised, and what is rather are national assessment frameworks and national assessments that are conducted in schools at certain key stages, as opposed to fostering the certain skills associated with global citizenship. And the second point, which was around progressions, and look, I think we're still working this out, how we proceed with it, because we're toying with different ideas. What is coming out, and I've had a bit of a tinker with this, I could have shown it, but it was just a draft, was a scale of progression when it comes to the different levels of competencies that a teacher or a student, so I'm interested in seeing how we might be able to develop a scale that applies to both teachers and students when it comes to the initial skill you would have in terms of identifying and making connections regarding global citizenship. and progressing up that scale, how those skills develop over time. So what might it look like when you're a beginner? How might that skill progress over time? And what might it look like at the expert stage? So we really do believe that it's not an either or, it's a skill that is progressive. And I know myself, when I started working in this space over 10 years ago, I had very different ideas than I have now. So I've developed as a learner in this space, and I can see where I fit on different scales when it comes to progressing my understanding of, say, intercultural competence or global issues and the connection between global issues in different countries around the world. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good. All right, and for our third speaker, Professor Benevot, I look forward to listening to you.
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation to contribute to this discussion. I have been working in this area of the global monitoring, not necessarily of global citizenship education, but more generally Target 4.7 since I served as director of the Global Education Monitoring Report in 2016. And I would just like to make a couple preliminary remarks before I kind of dive into the more details. And I must say also I have quite a few slides here that I'm going to skip over, partly because some of the material has already been covered by my colleagues, and I appreciate that, and also because time really doesn't allow for, at least the current time, for more some more subtle points. So first of all, I'd like to just talk about the idea of monitoring, which does not appear in any of the official documents that help to define the Sustainable Development Goals. It is not in the major document. The wording that's used is to follow up and review. Now, you might think that this is a subtle distinction between the notion of following up and review versus monitoring, but clearly member states, both of UNESCO but more generally of the UN, were very reluctant, I would say mildly ambivalent, perhaps even antagonistic, to incorporating the notion of monitoring in the founding document of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So it's important to keep in mind that some of the work here is work that is seen in a less than positive light by many of the countries that are involved in global monitoring of 4.7. Secondly, I think a lot of countries are overwhelmed by the indicator framework that was established. So we have 17 goals, 169 targets, and 230 plus global indicators, which for many countries was an enormous task, both in terms of time and effort, to say nothing of the resources that would be needed in order to adequately provide information about each of the different targets, including Target 4.7. So there's a part of the ambivalence and maybe even antagonism around some of the monitoring framework is because it's too large, too complex, and too demanding of time and resources. The third point that I'd like to make is a preliminary point, and here it's wonderful to come after the first two colleagues, is that the global monitoring that emerges from the work, let's say, of the Global Education Monitoring Report should not be seen as trying to displace or undermine or substitute very legitimate and important efforts of monitoring either at the national level or the regional level or other levels, even municipal monitoring that might occur. All types and approaches to monitoring, I think, are welcome and have different purposes, as Professor Kerr mentioned at the beginning, and therefore we shouldn't see one as necessarily more important or more central than others. They all have, I think, a space and something to contribute to trying to understand progress that countries are making in this particular area. The last point I wish to make, and this might seem a bit curious, is that I've come to the conclusion that in some ways the way forward in some of the areas around Target 4.7 may actually be drawing on the legitimacy of other international policy frameworks in order to develop a database or a set of measures that speak to Target 4.7. I know it sounds like, why would you want to go elsewhere to kind of say something about Target 4.7? But partly because of the work that I've been doing around climate change education, in which the rationalization for developing climate education indicators comes from a completely different framework program. This is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that has within it a paragraph set aside for educational monitoring and evaluation. And there is a pillar devoted to education, another pillar devoted to training. And the constraints that are found in Target 4.7 don't exist in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In other words, there's much more openness for a multiplicity of measures and monitoring strategies, which I actually see as a blessing, maybe in disguise, that in some ways we can come back by using another, let's say, international convention or international basis to say something of value vis-a-vis at least some aspects of 4.7. All of those are preliminary remarks. So what's the main issue that my paper or this presentation seeks to make? Is that although the global community made an enormous effort to come up with the most ambitious, holistic, comprehensive, and in some ways the most transformative agenda ever imagined in 2015 when it agreed upon the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it did not develop, simultaneous to this, a robust measurement, reporting, and monitoring platform that enabled, let's say, global monitors like myself and the team that I run to capture the kind of country efforts that were being undertaken. And this is especially true for Target 4.7. So as we've seen, there was a global indicator for Target 4.7 that talked about the mainstreaming of the different aspects of 4.7 in policies, in the curriculum and teacher training, and in assessment. But there was no existing data sets or databases or any kind of information that currently existed that would enable a global education monitoring report to say something with respect to that global indicator. And we worked very hard on the team in 2015 and 2016 to figure out a way how we would devise some new data, some new measurement that would enable us to say something about that global indicator. What UNESCO ended up decided, UNESCO had the, let's say, the responsibility, the institutional responsibility to come up with a measurement of the global indicator 4.7.1. And what it decided to do, as has already been said, and that was not an obvious decision that was taken by members in the education sector, was to repurpose this 1974 recommendation that countries, because it's a recommendation, has a certain status. It's not just true of UNESCO, it's true of the UN, that countries are expected to report every 4 years on the progress that they're making vis-a-vis the implementation of a recommendation. The decision by UNESCO was to say, let's use that existing monitoring strategy, in other words, countries reporting every 4 years as the extent to which they're implementing the 1974 recommendation, expand upon it to include areas that were part of 4.7, but were not part of the 1974 recommendation, and that becomes the basis for monitoring Target 4.7. Seems like a reasonable solution to a complex problem, but what we ended up having was a monitoring framework that was very unfit for purpose, as I will demonstrate in just a moment. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the current decisions that have been made in order to develop a measure for Target 4.7, which I consider, and I think most of the people in this room consider, to be one of the most ambitious, transformative, potentially transformative targets within the agenda, the current information that we have available is highly problematic and really tells us very little of what progress is being made, at least at a national, regional, or at a global level. I'm not going to get into all the details, but I have written a very extensive paper on this topic that was published last year earlier, and if you are interested, I would invite you to read the paper. It's called Can We Transform Global Education Without Transforming How We Monitor Progress, with my colleague James William from George Washington University, and here we go into a lot of the details that I will mention. Here's this idea about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that provides legitimation for looking at issues of education in a completely different way or from a different vantage point that has relevance for at least some aspects of 4.7, and especially for the indicator 13.3, which the measure of which, or the global indicator of which, is exactly the same as target 4.7. And again, UNESCO has the statutory responsibility to provide information for global monitoring for both 4.7 and for target 13.3, which is the climate education or climate action target. We've already talked about 4.7.1. The only thing that I would like to say that hasn't come out, and I'm sorry that I don't have it listed here, is that in the definition of target 4.7, it talks about knowledge and skills. And in the run-up to the final formulation of target 4.7, the word skills was used in two different ways. It was explicitly distinguished between hard skills and actually soft skills. And so the first formulation of 4.7 specifically distinguished between hard skills and soft skills, and it was only subsequent to all kinds of decisions that went on in a meeting in Muscat, Oman in May of 2014 that it was decided to link the two together. So even though our association, when we think about skills, are skills for the labor market, skills that are typically employability skills, the intention of those that formulated 4.7 was both knowledge and skills that we might call today social emotional or other kinds of soft skills. And that's something that often is lost to many people who look at target 4.7 for monitoring. Okay, I've already explained why the 1974 recommendation is important. What I now want to show you is why I think it's unfit for purpose. So here are some of the recommendations that have been passed by UNESCO over the years, and what you have in the cells here are the percentage of member states of UNESCO that send reports at various occasions to the UNESCO, depending on which sector they're from. And here you can see the 1974 recommendation at the very highest point. Only 40% of the 196 member states of UNESCO sent in a report about the activities that they were undertaking in order to implement the adoption of the recommendation. So that means that 60% of the member states did not provide any information at all. The second point is that of those that sent reports, many of the reports were partial. In other words, they answered a survey in which they did not answer all the questions to the survey. So whatever information was provided was incomplete and impartial in many ways. And this breaks it down by different parts of the world. You can see that some regions of the world, the member states were more involved in providing reports, but in other parts of the world, only a small percentage of the member states provided information. And part of the problem is let's call it the strategy for doing a survey research from UNESCO headquarters. The typical technique is that you send the survey to the national commissions of each country, and they're expected to send it to the ministries or to other people in responsibilities. You have absolutely no idea what happens to the survey once it's sent to the NatCom, to the National Commission. It could sit on somebody's desk, they could fill it out there, they could send it maybe to the ministry, somebody could sit on the desk and fill it out. There's absolutely no indication of the extent to which a serious kind of attempt is made to provide authentic and reliable information about the survey questions So what we end up getting is information that we have, that countries provide, that we're meant to accept it without any form of validation of the information or the box that have been ticked. And so that's the basic reason, or that I conclude together with my colleagues, that the current mechanism for reporting on the 1974 recommendation, which is the basis of reporting for Target 4.7, is unfit for purpose, and in some ways the data that is being collected is garbage. So we can't use it. There's absolutely nothing, in my view, at least from a global monitoring perspective, it isn't something that I would want to sign my name on, right? So we have to look elsewhere. That's partly the idea. What can we think about as an alternative monitoring strategy? And that's something that I'm engaged in. What can we think about as an alternative way of providing information that is validated to some sense, and provides some information about real country efforts to implement the commitments they've made to one of the most transformative targets in the entire 2030 agenda, including obviously global citizenship education. Here's some of the findings from the most recent report. You can see countries are very complementary to themselves. All of them are implementing the principles. It sounds absolutely, what we might say, hunky-dory. It sounds like they're doing a wonderful job in implementing each of the guiding principles. But this is the kind of information that if you ask countries to report on what they're doing, they provide you with very rosy information, which is meaningless if 90% of the countries say they're all doing the same thing, right? So the current strategy is not fit for purpose and really is the wrong way forward. Now the question is, where are we going to go? And there's two ways to think about this. And I think the best way to think about this, can we expand upon and improve upon the existing basis for monitoring Target 4.7, and there potentially is, let's say, some potential there, or do we need to look completely in another direction? And I think it's not either or, it might be both of those approaches might be plausible ways forward. And what do I mean about improving what we now have as the basis? As most of you know, the 1974 recommendation, after 2 years of very intensive work by headquarters at UNESCO, has devised a revised recommendation that next month, depending on whether the gods be kind or not, will be adopted by UNESCO member states, in which case it'll be called the 2023 recommendation. It is also an incredibly ambitious statement that has a lot of details, including around global citizenship, and for the purposes of monitoring, it opens up some new opportunities that were not in the original 1974 recommendation. There are several paragraphs that are devoted, they don't use the word monitoring, they use the word follow-up and review. Keep in mind, they never talk about monitoring. It's all about follow-up and review. But at this point, and I think I'm going to skip here quite a few slides to get to it, what we have now is, first of all, we have a new definition of global citizenship education, which has not existed in any of the documents. In other words, if they accept this recommendation, there'll be an official international definition of GCED, which is what you have in front of you. Interestingly, this was the definition that you find in a footnote in the Education 2030 Framework for Action, and it comes from a technical report that was done in 2013. So it's 10 years old, but if you look at it, it's a fairly interesting definition. Talks about knowledge, cognitive skills, it talks about non-cognitive skills, it talks about behavioral capacities. It is a holistic kind of version of global citizenship. This will become the official definition of global citizenship once this recommendation is adopted. So you should learn it very carefully because it's hard to find. You have to go through 2 different footnotes and 3 different documents to be able to uncover what the actual definition is. And it's 10 years old. And one wonders whether or not that's the best definition we could come up with, but that's what we have, right? All right, and what does the monitoring look like? The monitoring basically says all member states are required to report, again, every 4 years, and it isn't specific to this recommendation, it's specific to all recommendations, right? They're they're meant to engage in a broad understanding fostering policy dialogue that includes both member states and civil society, that there would be a multiplicity of follow-up approaches that would include member states, UNESCO, member states with UNESCO, and practitioners and other stakeholders. Now, why is that a really critical point? Because up until now, it's been the member states that have essentially had the veto power about any kind of data that's going to be used for the monitoring or follow-up or review of any aspect of Target 4.7. But in this rendition of this new recommendation, which again is the basis for monitoring Target 4.7, there are now, it's a multi-stakeholder approach to the monitoring of Target 4.7. And that's an interesting opportunity. So the question is, if you were to engage in policy dialogue with civil society groups, with practitioners, with other stakeholders, would you begin to get a different view about progress with respect to global citizenship education or any of the other elements of Target 4.7? In principle, that's what you'd want to do. An engaged monitoring strategy would take this very seriously. And the first monitoring report for the new recommendation, if indeed it's adopted next month, will be in 2026. So we'll have to wait to see 4 years from now or 3 years from now what this will look like. I would venture to say that for all kinds of purposes, they will have, again, a very elaborate survey that will be sent to the national commissions that will be asked to comment on progress that they've made. It will not change dramatically, even though there's been some new windows that have opened. And partly because of my less than optimistic attitude about what kind of report we can anticipate in 3 or 4 years, I think we need to look elsewhere. And although I don't have enough time, I'm more than happy to explain that I think that there's a lot of other kinds of information that can be captured, can be mobilized, can be analyzed to provide a valid, fairly objective idea of the extent to which countries are making good on their commitments, whether it be on global citizenship education, education for sustainable development, and many of the other wonderful concepts that are embedded in Target 4.7. And I think I'll end at that point.
Thank you very much, Aaron. If you would all like to come and sit up at this front table, that would be excellent. What you've just heard from the 3 speakers has been more a description of what they've been doing and what their findings are. And with the exception of Aaron, who couldn't help himself, they didn't move into some of the issues that emanate from what they've been looking at. And so what we're going to talk about now is pick up on where Aaron left off for Dr. Juanbo and Rachel, in particular, to pick up on some of the issues that they've seen in their work. And so rather than being descriptive, they're going to be identifying some of the issues or challenges or the points that they find of particular interest to them. And so any of the issues that any of them raise, the others are very welcome to comment on. And in fact, that would be welcomed. So we'll start with you, Professor Juanbo.
Okay, thank you very much, Esther. I'd like to raise some point. I think the GCED policy can be monitored based on the GCED reinterpreted in or contextualized concept according to each country's context, rather than the universal standard. We are focusing on the universal standard. So more important thing is more important than mainstreaming GCED in policy or curricula is how these efforts actually impact the improvement of the learner's global citizenship. And also, I mean, why comparing country is valuable it is equally essential to closely monitor policy implementation with each individual country, or even in the school level. I think the teacher can also the agency who conceptualize the GCED in the context of their school and reorganize and apply it to their class. So, but as you know, we discuss about the universal concept of GCED at the global level, and we make some monitoring system and framework, and we share the result of the monitoring framework and the monitor and collect the data. But I think it is important to discuss each country how they conceptualize GCED in their context, and each teacher and each school conceptualize the GCED in their context. So, and we gather this kind of information, and we need to develop the framework of the GCED monitoring.
Thank you. I'm going to invite both of you to come in on this point. So part of the point that's being made here is the distinction between how GCED might be seen within country versus how GCED might be conceptualized globally, and then the degree to which there are differences across countries in their conceptualizations, such that it may be difficult to identify a standard, if we're going to call that, a standard way of monitoring. And we've heard both about the examples from the Korean context where Dr. Park said GCED policies can be monitored based on GCED reinterpreted according to each country's context, right, rather than any universal perspectives. What we heard from Rachel was more about, actually, I won't talk for you, I'll hand it over to you to talk about that differentiation that you were drawing on, about saying that the context is critical for the interpretations. Rachel?
Thanks, Esther. I might just share a little bit of experience, sort of what's brought me to that way of thinking, and part of that comes from working on the Southeast Asia Primary Learning Metrics program, and that was, as I mentioned, around 10 years ago when we started working on designing a framework and some tools to measure grade 5 students' attitudes and values toward global citizenship education, global citizenship related topics, skills and teachers' confidence in teaching those skills. And to this audience, I'd say it wasn't very useful. There were some serious problems. Pyle also works with me on it, so she's very familiar with it. And we're shifting away from that kind of approach, as Aaron, you mentioned, that quite a lot of responses from participants can be, they're essentially not a lot of variation between responses. There's a lot of affirmative response bias among those results, so they're not very useful in terms of getting an understanding of what's occurring on the ground, where the gaps are, those kinds of things. So we're shifting toward an understanding and a movement towards enactment when it comes to global citizenship and readiness to enact, and looking at it from a holistic point of view, so not just the skills and values and attitudes of students, and behavioural intentions, but also how the system, the school, classroom and teacher supports that enactment. So what might be some readiness factors? So we see in this system that certain policies are present, the assessment frameworks and curricula have identified and elaborated global citizenship competencies. Teachers have certain skills and knowledge, so I'm sort of seeing it like a traffic light system. You might have 3 greens, an amber and a red when it comes to this whole system view of readiness to enact global citizenship.
Thank you. I'm going to throw over to Aaron here. Aaron, you've also mentioned that different countries have different understandings, different histories and so on of global citizenship. And so I could continue with the question of, well, how can we have a standard approach to monitoring? But at the same time, you've presented some much bigger issues about monitoring more generally. So can you talk about whether there is any point in us thinking about the differences between countries and regions, given the fact that you've got major issues with the approach altogether?
So thanks very much for this question. I mean, as I ponder, target 4.7, which is a very complex target, and one of the things that's clear to us that on the one hand, you have the target speaking primarily about the outcomes of some educational process, talking about knowledge and skills, whether they be hard skills or soft skills. So we're thinking, let's call it learning outcomes or educational outcomes from some intervention. And I always make the point that the target speaks about all learners, not just learners in school. So for me, it's important to also develop measures that would look at outcomes among those who are out of school, including adults and not just young people who are in school, which makes it even more complex. I agree. But at least in terms of how I conceptualize the target. But the indicator that I led a team to try to develop data around is not about the outcomes, but rather about the input side. So it's asking, are countries making serious attempts to mainstream these particular topics and themes in policies, in curricula, in teacher preparation, and in assessments? Now the assumption is that those countries that are mainstreaming to a greater extent global citizenship education, for example, in policies, in curricula, in teacher preparation and assessments, should, other things being equal, bring about better and more extensive outcomes in knowledge and skills. Not that we have really strong data demonstrating that that kind of relationship holds, but that's the underlying assumption. The monitoring challenge has primarily been on the global indicator, which is on the input side, and we've heard enormously interesting work that is ongoing at ASER to try to look at on the output side, which I congratulate them and how they're trying to deal with it, right? But so there are different issues that are being addressed. There's different kind of, in my view, that are different kinds of monitoring challenges to look at the outcomes or to look at the inputs and to look at both of them in school or out of school. So for me, that whole complexity is part of the issues that keep me awake at night, as it were, trying to figure out. And much of the effort that I've made remains on the input side. So I've been involved in collecting national curricular framework policy documents. My colleagues and I have collected these documents for 150 countries around the world, in which we analyze them based on a series of keywords, primarily with respect to the greening of these policy documents. Do they include something on environment? Do they include something on sustainability? Do they include something on climate change? And you begin to look using qualitative methodology, are they embracing the discourse? And it's being mainstreamed in the policy document. Now that's a pretty high level document. Since last year, in December, we've been going to another kind of a document, which is the subject syllabi in sciences and social sciences for grade 9 and more recently for grade 3 and grade 6, where we've collected the curricular documents that are being produced in ministries of education by curricular units, primarily for teachers and for principals who teach those classes. And they're in 30 different languages, but we're doing the same kind of analysis. Does the subject syllabus or the subject curriculum include reference to climate change or environment or sustainability? And in principle, you could do the same thing for GCED, right? You could look, does it include international mindedness? Does it include cosmopolitanism? Does it include global citizenship? You could look for a different set of keywords in the same kind of documents, and those documents are a little bit closer to what actually happens in classrooms. You could even look at textbooks and do the same thing. So for me, these are documents that are being produced by countries not for monitoring purposes per se, but rather for the kind of everyday If you're going to construct a school system, you need to have a curriculum, right? And we're taking these documents and now putting them to an independent analysis in a more validated way. I think it's possible to do global monitoring of the mainstreaming of global citizenship in social science curricula in countries around the world, because I'm not interested in how they understand global citizenship or how they put it into practice, but whether or not it's included to begin with. And for me, that's you might say, well, it's a minimum definition, but that's what the indicator asks. Are they mainstream? It doesn't say, are they mainstreaming it deeply or at an intermediate level or superficially? It's just saying, do they mainstream it? And for that reason, we can do global monitoring. There's no problem. You could do the same thing in terms of teacher preparation. You could do the same thing in terms of assessment. You can collect, as it were, the official, what do we want to, administrative kind of documents that are being produced and put them to a content analysis to determine the extent to which countries are making good on their promise. It could be it's very superficial, the teachers aren't really doing anything in the classroom, we don't really have evidence of what goes on. That's, in some sense, beside the point. That would be quality GCED, right? That would be if we had information. But from the purposes of global monitoring, I first want to know, do they include it? Is it being mainstream?
Thanks, Aaron. I agree that, that's absolutely possible. And we've done that a number of times. We've reviewed curricula, we've identified keywords, we've looked at the extent to which the curricula in ASEAN member countries and also in Australia reflects global citizenship key topics, content skills, behavioural intentions, and how those are articulated through the curricula. We've found strong evidence to suggest that exists. What I'm concerned about is enactment, that we continue to talk about global citizenship and its importance, and I see what we're doing as this big cloud that sits above the school environment and there's no permeation. It doesn't reach the classroom level, and we've experienced that with CPLM, where we were asking questions about understanding with relation to environmental issues, climate change, and we received very positive results, and we saw these topics embedded across curricula at the grade 5 level, and we overheard students asking administrators, what is climate change? And the administrators saying, oh, it's when the temperature changes. So what we know is that these things might exist at a policy level, at a documentation level, but they're not coming down to the classroom, and that's a real concern, especially in an environment in Australia in particularly where we're seeing a rise of right-wing populism. As Karina mentioned, a recent no victory for the campaign against the Indigenous voice to Parliament. It's very concerning, and we have to do something about enactment.
Yeah, I totally agree with your point, and the minimum standard is very important to monitor globally. But my view is that in Korea, if we use a minimum standard to monitoring mainstreaming in GCED policy and curriculum, we have 100%, always 100% of the GCED in terms of mainstreaming in Korean education policy. But we still questions about, is it real? Is it reality? So that's why we need to talk about the conceptualization to monitor globally or each country, and we need to more the focus on the outcomes of the learners, the global citizenship competency. So, and the input side, regarding to input side, monitoring can be the interpreted the GCED concept, but the outcomes, the learning outcome, including the GC, global citizenship, and the sustainable development, we need to effort more in to concept of the GC outcomes.
Thank you. Just to ensure that everybody's on the same page with this, when we think about monitoring of SDG Goal 4 generally, the majority, we talk mostly about 4.1, 4.2 and so on, and all of those indicators are about looking at student outcomes, right? That's what we typically monitor. So that is the reason that this is such an issue, because it's the other end, it's the input end. And if we think about evaluation studies over many years, there's been a negativity about an inputs model, that you need to look at what are the outcomes of things. You've got to prove that you've done something. You've got to have accountability. So it's an interesting phenomenon that we're going around again. One of the things that has occurred to me is the positive aspect of this, that if you focus on the inputs, notwithstanding the fact that we have lots of difficulties with measuring those, if you focus on the inputs and not on student assessment outcomes, there might be a positive outcome here, that countries themselves might be less concerned about summative assessment of student outcomes that are associated with global citizenship. And I can't see that that would not be a good thing. In other words, I think that would be a good thing. So I don't know if you've thought about that relationship, the one between what then a country is going to have to report on and therefore have visibility and maybe credibility or not about, versus the impact on how they might then treat the outcomes. And the other part of that question is that if at a national level, and if there are politics around inclusion of some of these new imperatives, if you can't show that there are associated student outcomes, how might that roll out? Anyway, Rachel.
As you were talking, I changed my mind about wanting to respond. Oh, it's not relevant, but I've just been thinking a lot about a colleague's work in engagement, and it's another messy, nebulous concept in education, and she developed a continuum for measuring engagement, which can be used by teachers and students. But it doesn't fulfill what you're talking about in terms of system-level monitoring and global monitoring, but it is an incredibly powerful tool for students to be able to identify where they sit on an engagement continuum, from disrupting, avoiding, participating, investing, driving, and very intuitive. And I wonder whether it's possible for us to be thinking about global citizenship in the same way, on a continuum from one to another end, in terms of a theory of change, a progression.
Thank you. Before we go on, I think we better pick up in case there are some questions from the group. I know that we could probably talk a lot and we wouldn't hear from other people. So if there are any questions, can you put up your hand now? Grace.
Thanks. Thanks very much. A really interesting discussion, bringing up some old memories as well, because I was involved in discussions around CPLM years ago as well, so it's really interesting to hear your 10-year-on perspective as well. One thing that strikes me, Rachel, you made a comment. You said we can't agree on the what when it comes to GCED, and I want to push you on that just a little bit, actually, because in contrast to that statement, Aaron put up the definition that's being proposed in the revised 74 recommendation. And having been involved in the debates and discussions many years ago, not everybody agreed that it wouldn't be possible to come up with a definition. And in other UN, in particular, discussions and debates, particularly that I've had in the area of health, WHO has bit the bullet and said we have to, because we need a definition if we want to be able to properly monitor this issue. So I guess I just want to push you a little bit and say, are you sure that we really are so far away from an agreement on a definition? And then related to that, I guess the other point is just that there's a lot of concepts even in that definition that Aaron put up on the screen that's the proposed definition in the 74 revised text. And but I also think maybe one of the things we need to do is start talking a little bit more about what isn't part of global citizenship education, because the problem is it becomes this sort of catch-all, loosely tossed around substitute for lots of different things. You know, actually, I don't think it does necessarily mean transformative education, for example, but we've heard people sort of interchange the two terms, for example. So I do think in terms of monitoring, we maybe need to think about tightening up our use of the expression, and that gets to me back to the point about definitions. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. That's a really complex question. I'm going to get you later. I mean, I have been engaging with this particular topic and talking a lot about it, and yeah, I don't agree that we agree on the content. I don't agree that I think that we could have conversations over dinner and completely disagree on things like human rights, on trans rights, on gender equity, unfortunately, on democracy. These issues, we don't hold the same views on them, and we have to acknowledge that. We don't agree on the what, but I do agree with what you said about we have to proceed without agreeing. We need to. But I just don't believe that among so many countries, if it is a global endeavour, that we agree on all of these issues. And we have definitions of global citizenship that are general enough to hide these disagreements within them. But when you get down to it and have conversations, and we had these conversations during the development of CPLM, we have certain people who would like this removed or that added. That is evidence to me that we don't agree on the content for global citizenship. And I've come to the conclusion 10 years in that if we don't, we never will, and we could spend forever arguing about what global citizenship is and never actually take this forward into practice and actually shift things for education for sustainable development or education for global citizenship. That's the start of the answer to your question.
I tended to share Rachel's view, but you know, I had this wonderful opportunity a couple of years ago to work with colleagues at EPSAU to try and determine the extent to which there is some kind of overlapping terms. We looked at both policy and curricular documents in 23 Asia-Pacific countries. Forget exactly how many documents we ended up collecting and analyzing. There was primarily curricular documents for grade 8 or for 13-year-olds. And I remember when Esther and I spoke about, you know, when we basically looked at the number of times certain terms emerged or were found across the documents in different countries, we kind of came to this tentative conclusion that there's a core set of terms that seem to be shared across extremely diverse jurisdictions, and there's another set of terms that tend to be idiosyncratic to a particular country. And so one of the ways forward, again, you know, the definition that's put up here is a bit of a conceptual definition. As a social scientist, you begin to think, well, how do I operationalize that? And so one of the ways you could operationalize it would be to say, I'm going to try to operationalize those terms that do seem to have a certain, you know, kind of buy-in by a fairly widespread group of countries, and keep to the side the ones that are idiosyncratic, obviously, which are very meaningful in the particular context in which they're being used. And it's not to deny the importance of that by any stretch of the imagination. But for the purposes of international monitoring, I think that you could make an argument that if we could go so far as to identify those shared, whatever, subdimensions or, you know, terms that seem to have fairly strong buy-in across many different countries and do the monitoring around there, we actually may find a way forward. So it's kind of like in between saying it's impossible, or, you know, we're going to take one definition and kind of force it down the throats of everyone. So I do think that it's a complex thing, though, because obviously, you know, when I look at the climate terms, those are understood in a much more uniform way. There's a kind of a, when you talk about climate science or you talk about biodiversity, you talk about environmental pollution, or whatever it may be, there's a kind of, there's a common understanding across people and languages and cultures of what that entails. When you talk about citizenship and you talk about international understanding and what that entails, you get very different perspectives and worldviews, and that's a little bit where the problem begins. But it's part of the challenge. I don't see it as something we shouldn't try to do. I think it's something that we just need to work harder and to see what, rather than start from an a priori position, say it's impossible, therefore why spend, the time and effort to do so?
You wanted to
I just wanted to share my own experience. Regarding the content, yes, we cannot have any agreement on content itself, but still we can agree on kind of a set of parameters, although we have, once again, we have a different range, and I'm pretty sure Esther has, we also experience, with Laos and Bhutan, we realize that we are not talking the same terms, but it's always a dialogic process in a way. So not only the concept of global citizenship education or education for sustainable development evolve, but at the same time, because we are living and working with the people from different backgrounds and diversity, so it's a constant dialogic process. And for me, the merit of having this 4.7.1, although it's not end goal, certainly we want to know learning outcome, but merit of having it is to really push the countries at the policy level, curriculum level, they want to really open the possibility. So for me, it's more of opening possibility. So once again, I know that there's no time, but going back to the idea of, so what is this monitoring for, depending on how you see it. Sometimes I see it, more in terms of, what is the benefit of it in terms of when I carry out the program, or when I try to expand the kind of horizon. So that's one thing. But I had also very specific questions to Aaron, because you once said that, you called it garbage, the 1974 survey. And you raised the issue of it was not validated, so there's a validation issue. And on the one hand, it seems that you suggest that for instance, the work of yours, it's really kind of, it goes through the validation process. But on the other hand, you also kind of imply that there's a possibility of diverse voices kind of present themselves because we have to cover not only formal education but non-formal education. So possibility of different reports, different kinds of monitoring effort just probably shared. And then once again, how would you validate those data? And also, just to share some of the comments from my colleagues from other countries working on curriculum development and integration project, they keep saying that it requires a lot of resources, but not only resources in terms of financial resources, but human resources. For instance, I mentioned about 1974 survey. Not only they didn't know, but they have a difficulty kind of writing a report in English, for instance. So it requires resources. So that's there are many other kind of aspects of monitoring. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Chongmin. The conversation that Aaron sparked about there being some components of global citizenship that might be more or less valued in different countries, or that we might see things differently. It reminds me, I don't know if any of you looked at the work of Super and Sverko. This is going back to something like, 1978, 79, something like that. And they worked on concepts on values. And they did very wide-ranging international studies on values across, I can't remember, 13 countries, or maybe it was 26 and then a subgroup. And what they identified was that there are a lot of core values, in other words, values that were shared across those countries. They weren't necessarily all held to the same degree of value within those countries, but there were core values. But also, each of those countries had other values that were not shared. And so in terms of measurement development, it was very useful because it meant that they could put together an assessment of values where they could value, or they could measure what was shared and in common and leave alone what was not. And so maybe that's another thing for us to think about, that even if we don't see some of the concepts or components within global citizenship in exactly the same way, perhaps we can go some way toward identifying what is common and focus more on that. The concern for me is that if we decide that global monitoring of GCED is not viable, or if it's too difficult, we need to be thinking about what's again the functionality. If comparative reporting isn't viable, then what's in it for countries to monitor at all? In other words, what do countries look for by virtue of engaging in global monitoring? And of course, as Aaron pointed out, most countries are not anyway. 60% of countries are not doing it. So it looks as though they're not seeing a great deal of utility in it, or they have some cultural cringe about it, which might be another aspect of this. So I'd like just a couple of sentences from each of you as we finish up. We've just got about 3 minutes, and I'd like to hear from each of you. Juanva?
Thank you very much, Esther. I totally agree with your point. And the short sentence, I think we have been mainly interested in the result of monitoring when we discuss the GCED monitoring. But the monitoring process itself is also important, as well as the use or the result of monitoring. So I think it can be a process of learning for each country to monitor GCED. So this is a kind of the value of the monitoring GCED globally. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Park. I think in terms of a way forward for monitoring global citizenship, again, as I presented, I'd be thinking about it from a systemic, holistic point of view, because it's a holistic concept. So looking across the way in which school systems and classrooms are ready to enact global citizenship. I don't think there's a single way, and I think that definitions are problematic, but we can certainly proceed with a process for monitoring global citizenship.
I don't accept the premise that you started with, that the global monitoring of global citizenship education or any aspect of 4.7 is impossible, right? I would say that the current models that we have established are not very effective in getting us where we want to go, right? So I think we need to be thinking outside the box. And, I've been in this business maybe 20 years, and the first thing I can tell you is that the monitoring landscape today is unlike anything that existed during the EFA period, right? There has been a revolution, although you might not call it that, in the way in which UIS works, the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, the Global Monitoring Report works, and the kind of information that it's able to mobilize today to look at a very wide range of aspects of the SDG 4 agenda that were simply not possible 20 years ago. That said, I also think that partly because of the constraints that were mentioned, we need to be thinking about not relying on UNESCO or UNESCO Institute for Statistics to be the place where we go for information in this area. And so I've called for, and if you read the article, my colleagues and I call for an independent, crowdsourced, open access platform that we would build up over the course of several years, all kinds of information relevant to Target 4.7 that would be vetted by experts, in which you allow all kinds of stakeholders around the world to contribute. And so you try to transcend the financial constraints that currently exist for the, the kind of the high-level monitoring. But the global monitoring that we look for becomes an emergent property after you've worked on it over some period of time. And the only model, and I apologize for taking so much time, I worked with an enormously beautiful guy at IBE, Massimo Amadio, for many years. And IBE had responsibility for carrying out the global conference on education in Geneva once every 3 years. And in conjunction with that conference, the IBE used to collect information from member states about very particular topics. And he built up a kind of a qualitative data set, case studies about every country in the world. And each time, instead of asking countries to reinvent the wheel, he would send them the profile that he had online and ask, update it for me. Just tell me what's new. And that was a much easier ask for the IBE to give to countries than saying, here's a questionnaire, fill it out from top to bottom, from beginning to end. That becomes a real difficult thing for a lot of countries to do. And they throw up their hands and they say, we don't have the resources for that. But if you build up a kind of a platform that is dynamic, that is open-ended, that is involving many different stakeholders who all wish to see this transformative target go forward, I think in 5 years you could get pretty far.
Thank you very much. It's nice to end on a positive, affirmative note. So thank you, everybody, for your attention and for your participation. Thanks all.